The RTX 3080 20GB and 3070 16GB might have just been cancelled. But what does this mean for the 3080 Ti? Let's talk about it. Before that, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss another video. So a recent leak from videocards.com just came out stating that apparently the 20GB 3080 and 16GB 3070 might have just been canceled. And of course, a link will be in the description below so you can see everything they have to say on the matter. But I'm going to go ahead and read a little part of the article here and then give my thoughts on the whole matter and then discuss whether or not the 3080 Ti still might exist. But in any case, this is what Videocards has to say on the matter. Quote, "This still very fresh information comes from two independent sources. Technically, GeForce RTX 3080 20GB and RTX 3070 16GB could launch at a later time, but the information that we have clearly stated that those SKUs have been canceled, not postponed." So I know this information might be a little bit shocking and somewhat unbelievable considering the fact that there's been such heavy rumors around these cards, and many of us were expecting these to come out at some point near the end of this year or even potentially early next year. But you know, I think that this article is probably true and they probably have canceled the 20GB and 16GB variants of these cards, which I know a lot of you are probably scratching your head and asking the question, well, why wouldn't Nvidia give you more VRAM? I mean, Big Navi's right around the corner and all the leaks and rumors are pointing towards a GPU that should have 16GB of VRAM. So Nvidia's going to be forced to compete with a GPU that has 10GB of VRAM, and in the case of the 3070, only 8GB of VRAM versus a 16GB card, which could be a huge selling point for AMD. And you're right, but you know, you have to consider the fact that there are multiple different reasons why, in a business perspective, this doesn't really make sense for Nvidia. So the first reason why I think this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for Nvidia to, you know, invest in giving you higher gigabyte capacity cards would be the fact that, say, they put out a 20GB 3080. Not only is that going to be kind of in competition with a 3090 now as a big selling point for the 3090 for semi-professionals, even though I don't think it has professional drivers, is the fact that it has 24GB of VRAM. And you know, the difference between 10 and 24GB of VRAM is a huge difference, but the difference between 20 and 24 is not so huge of a difference. So that would seriously cut into the sales of their big GPU, which, you know, in the long term, they could be losing out on a whole lot of margin there. And then on top of that, if they want to sell you a card in the future that has 16 or 20GB of VRAM for their next generation of cards as somewhat of an incentive for you to upgrade, well, then it's going to be a lot less incentivizing if you already have a card that has 20GB of VRAM. So, you know, that's one more reason in a business perspective as to why they might not want to offer you double the VRAM now. And yeah, I get you. The fact that AMD is going to have more VRAM will definitely, you know, turn a lot of people like myself to go with AMD potentially, because yes, you'll be able to get a card that can last quite a bit longer in terms of you'll be able to put all the settings to ultra for a lot longer time period without having serious problems such as maybe texture pop in, or maybe you get slightly lower frame times, or maybe your frame rate is just lower overall. So yeah, that's great for AMD, but typically for Nvidia consumers, they don't really either think about that stuff, or even if they know about it, it doesn't really bother them quite as much. They seem to be a lot more willing in the high-end GPU space to buy a card every, you know, 1 to 3 years versus someone who goes out there and buys, you know, maybe a RX 580 or maybe GTX 1060, and those types of people, the amount of VRAM on the card is very, very important. They need to have something that's potentially going to be future-proofed, because for them, they're probably not going to buy another card for a little while, so they're hoping that whatever they buy now, with maybe they have a 1080p or even potentially 1440p monitor, they're hoping that they'll be able to run decent settings for a long time. But if you look at, say, like an RTX 3080 class of GPU, those people are just looking more at, you know, how much performance can I get right now and maybe in the next year, and then they're probably going to be more willing to upgrade fairly soon. And, you know, if you look back in the past, Nvidia hasn't really had to offer more VRAM to still sell more GPUs. So, for example, if you take a look at like the 780 Ti 3GB versus the RX 290X, or I think it's called the R7 back then, but in any case, the 290X 4GB, yeah, the AMD card had a lot more VRAM back then. Then you look at like the RX 584 and 8GB versus the 1063 and 6GB. AMD still offered more VRAM in those cards, and you could go on and on and on and on. There's plenty of different examples where AMD's always offered you more VRAM, but typically still Nvidia's outsold them by a significant margin, even while offering you a little bit less. And yeah, they could potentially make a little bit more margin off of higher gigabyte cards like they are with the RTX 3090, but I think that would be a whole lot less competitive with Big Navi, and I think that points towards Big Navi maybe being a little bit better than many people are expecting, including Nvidia, at least for a little while here, because as more and more information comes out, it looks like Big Navi's actually going going to be competing with a 3080 and potentially even a 3090, which I think if Nvidia releases a card that's really not any faster and it just has more VRAM and they charge a whole lot more money for it, and you have like a 20 gigabyte 3080 at $850 versus the Big Navi card with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's coming in at like, I don't know, let's say $650, well, that's a whole lot less competitive than a 10 gigabyte version, and in reality, in most games, they're going to perform pretty much identically. So, you know, from a competitive standpoint, it also doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But there's one other question that still is out there, and that's, is there going to be an RTX 3080 Ti? And I think this is an interesting one because we haven't heard any information on a 3080 Ti for a really, really long time. In fact, the last thing I heard about a 3080 Ti was all the way back in July when an image was shared over at Video Cards of a potential 3080 Ti design from Asus. But looking back on that, it looks like that's the model they ended up using for the 3080 and 3090. So it's likely that that slide there was just a representation of whatever Nvidia was going to have, and they didn't know if it was going to be called 3080 Ti or 3090 or 3080 at the time, so they just slapped 3080 Ti on it. So there's really no concrete information on a 3080 Ti right now, at least not anything recent. But, you know, personally, if we take a look at their stack of GPUs right now, I think that if you look at the 3080 and the 3090, when you see that huge deficit, you can probably think to yourself, well, there's a whole lot of room to slot in another card, and it makes a whole lot of sense to me. So, for example, you have the 3080 with a 320-bit bus, only 10 gigs of VRAM, and has 8,704 shaders. Now, if you look at the RTX 3090, that card actually has over 10,000 shaders, a 384-bit bus, and 24 gigabytes of VRAM. So I think if Big Navi ends up beating the RTX 3080, even if it's only by a little bit, if the 6900 XT beats it in traditional rasterized games, it doesn't matter if it beats it in ray tracing. If it does beat it in just regular DirectX 11 games, well then I think that's going to make Nvidia look bad, and they don't want to have that happen. So what they could do is they could basically take the RTX 3090, shave maybe 2 or 3% of the shaders off of it, give you the same 384-bit bus, and just take 12 of those gigabytes of VRAM off the back of the card, give you a 12 gigabyte RTX 3080 Ti, and, you know, they could probably sell that for $800 to $1,000, which will probably, you know, if it turns out that AMD wants to charge a premium for their card and they want to charge somewhere between $800 to $1,000 for the 6900 XT, well then, you know, Nvidia looks pretty competitive now. You know, 12 versus 16 gigabytes isn't nearly as bad versus 10 with 10 versus 16 gigabytes because, you know, I think a lot of games coming up here are going to start, because of the new consoles, using at least 10 gigabytes of VRAM in 4K, whereas if you have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, I think you'll be fine with 99.9% of games, even going into the future for at least another year or two here, maxing out all the settings and not really having any issues. But that might not be the case with 10 gigabytes. So I think that could really get Nvidia out of some hot water. They could potentially reclaim their performance crown if the 6900 XT is a little bit slower than the 3090. And on top of that, I don't think it really take them a whole lot of work to do it. But overall, I do find this news to be a little bit disappointing. I hope it's not the case, but yeah, I think it does make sense. I think they are going to end up doing that. So hopefully we'll at least see an RTX 3080 Ti. But one thing's for sure, I'm really excited to see what Big Navi has to show on the 28th. And if you aren't subscribed already, I highly, highly suggest you go ahead, hit that subscription and the bell, because I do plan on live streaming that event just like I did with the Zen 3 event. And, you know, they're a whole lot of fun. A lot of people go and show up. I answer a lot of questions before and after the shows. And again, make sure you're subscribed so you can be there when I do that. But hey, that's just what I think. What do you think about the 20 gigabyte 3080 and 16 gigabyte 3070 being canceled? And do you think that the 3080 Ti does exist? I personally do, but I'd love to see what you have to say in the comments below. And of course, I'll see you in the next video. If you made it to the end of the video, be sure to drop a like. Every time you do so, Nvidia and Intel drop prices. Also, if you want to see more, click here. You won't be disappointed.